Greetings, AP European History scholars, for our review for Unit 13, which is on the Cold War. Looking at the review sheet from top to bottom here, you should know George Kennan and his policy of containment. Kennan was a diplomat to Moscow from the United States after World War II, and he has got what's called the famous long telegram, in which he argued that the Soviets are inherently expansionist, and he advocated this policy of containment. He said that the Soviets essentially are duplicitous, and they're dishonest, they're deceitful, they're aggressive. Communism is naturally going to expand and cross borders, and that what we need is a credible, physical, vigilant counter threat of military readiness with American boots on the ground, and this is going to lead to alliances like NATO and such, and sort of a permanent U.S. military presence in Europe after World War II. The Soviet argument for their behavior, which we're critical of, a number of things to consider. One is that the Russians/Soviets had been invaded by Germany twice in the 20th century, and they needed this buffer, this distance between themselves and Germany, even if it's at the expense of others, better than the expense of the Russian people, who suffered tens of millions of deaths at German hands in World War I and World War II. There is, of course, the ideological component that the communists really did believe in opposing American and Western capitalism and imperialism. There's also the argument that it's the U.S. that is the aggressor. We're the ones with soldiers, with bases, with alliances all around the Soviet Union, in Europe and in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia and in Korea. And there's also the argument that we are the ones who are preceding the Soviets at every turn with A-bombs and H-bombs, and that we are the ones who are doing the saber rattling. The Berlin blockade, it's when the Soviets cut off the previously agreed upon transportation routes into Berlin from West Germany, from the American, Brit, and French sectors. Remember, West Berlin is cut off. It's in the middle, it's sort of like an island in the middle of East Germany, which is the Soviet zone. This follows, the Soviets are angry at the creation of a Deutschmark, of a single West German currency, which was created on June 20, 1948. So the Soviet response follows. 4 days later, Stalin orders his East German puppets to cut off the links by rail, by water via rivers, and by road into West Berlin. And the plan here is to starve out a city of 2 million West Germans and to force the Allies to turn the city over to Russia. And the response is an airlift. The Berlin blockade is followed by this airlift of about 200,000 flights over the course of a calendar year, bringing about 8,000 tons a day to feed these people, and fuel and medical supplies and things like that. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is created under the Truman administration with the goal is to watch each other's back, a common defense against possible Soviet communist aggression into Western Europe. Remember, the Soviets have not left a good half of the Europe which Hitler had taken. So there's this feeling that Nazi aggression had been followed by communist tyranny. And I put on the review sheet to be familiar with Donald Trump and his campaign argument here that NATO is not pulling its weight, that NATO is living off of the United States, that there is unfairness here, that the Europeans somehow owe the United States for carrying them. And one of the current arguments against NATO by some like Trump is that the Europeans are supposed to pay a certain percent of their GNP towards the military, and very few countries, if any, are doing so. And you should know the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact is the communist counterpart to NATO. The Truman Doctrine in 1947, Truman gets Congress to come up with some aid to Greece and to Turkey. The Russians are leaning on the Turks, demanding open access through the Turkish Straits between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and Greece is suffering a civil war between communist guerrillas and the royalist government. The Marshall Plan is this post-war plan that begins in 1948 of U.S. economic aid for the purpose of rebuilding the economies of Western Europe. And there's another goal here, and that's to help the West Europeans resist the allure of communism. Now, you need to keep in mind here, this is 1948. This is 3 years after the defeat of the Nazis, and all those pictures you see in the videos we've watched and pictures you've seen in your textbook of these towns that have been reduced to rubble and these ruins are largely still like this. There's a lot of the physical destruction. There's a lot of hunger, a lot of joblessness, a lot of despair. There's been some particularly difficult winters, and the communists are promising, in particular Italy and France, they're promising a solution. They're promising jobs. They're promising a redistribution of wealth. And they're pointing at the Russians. The Russians have huge credibility. It's the Russian army that broke the back of the Nazi war machine. And the communists in these countries have a following. They have a huge following. And the idea of the Marshall Plan is we will provide something better than the communists could ever provide, and that is economic redevelopment, and to tie these countries firmly to the capitalist democratic West. And this is one of the arguments of the Soviets against the Marshall Plan, and that is it's a plot. It's a plot. It's a conspiracy to manipulate economically the Western Europeans for our benefit. And the Marshall Plan is largely successful. Western Europe does rebuild, and it becomes eventually economically prosperous and firmly embedded in a democratic and capitalist free market West. The communist countries in Europe after World War II, you should be familiar with, look at a map, you should be able to tell which countries were communist after 1945, which countries are in particular under the Soviet boot, and that would be East Germany, that would be the former Baltic states, which got their independence after World War I and then are taken over by Hitler and then by Stalin, and they're sort of swallowed by the USSR. And that would be Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. You also have Poland, you have Hungary, you have Czechoslovakia, you have Romania, you have Bulgaria, and then you have communist regimes in Albania and Yugoslavia, and they're eventually going to be essentially independent of the Soviet Union. The Albanians will pull out of NATO, and Yugoslavia, which does not share a border, will sort of march to its own beat here. But there is communism in Albania and Yugoslavia as well. And remember, there's this civil war with the communists in Greece that's being parried by money that's coming through the Truman Doctrine. Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956, Khrushchev, who follows Stalin after his death in 1953, condemns Stalin's cult of personality and condemns his crimes against socialism. Why does he do this? One is to consolidate his control. One is to marginalize those who are guilty supporters of Stalin. And one is to set up a course of reform. It's believed that Khrushchev really believed that communism could provide better for the needs of the typical Soviet citizen, the Soviet consumer, that life could be physically, materially better, and that this would be something that could happen better with some but limited criticism, namely of Stalin. Hungary, 1956, Imre Nagy, who is the leader of Hungary, is pursuing reform, is announcing that there will be elections, and he announces a withdrawal from the Warsaw Pact, and the Soviets will invade. And their justification is that there is counter-revolutionary activity. Capitalists and imperialists are thwarting the desire of the Hungarian people for socialism, which is the opposite of what is happening. So Hungary stays in the orbit of the Soviet camp here. Similarity and a difference with imperialism with that of Europe abroad as far as the Soviet invasion of Hungary. One similarity here is the use of military force and military control of what are essentially colonies, and the denial of self-government. One big difference is in Eastern Europe, the Soviets are imposing communism, the denial of what's called a private means of production, private ownership of capitalism. This is not really what's happening anywhere in the the African and Asian countries that are being colonized, and the imposition of atheism and a very, very rigorous denial of any form of civil rights, freedom of speech and press and movement and travel and education and assembly. These things are just outright denied in the Soviet satellite countries, where, I mean, there are limits in the countries that are being colonized by the Western Europeans, but nothing to this extent, and certainly not atheism as a state policy. The U-2 incident, those of you who watch Tom Hanks in Bridge of Spies are familiar with this, of course, if you saw that really cool movie. In 1960, a U.S. spy plane, a U-2 plane, is shot down over the Soviet Union. Francis Gary Powers is captured, put on trial, and he is going to be sentenced to, I think it's like 10 years in Soviet prisons. He's eventually swapped, which is the theme of the movie, for a Soviet counterpart spy. But this is going to cause the collapse of the coming Paris summit between Kennedy and Khrushchev. And this is one of these flashpoints in the Cold War where we're spying on the Russians/Soviets. I'm using these terms interchangeably. But it's one of these incidents of tension. The Berlin Wall was built in 1961, and the reason it's built is East Germany is hemorrhaging population. If you're from East Germany and you can get to East Germany, you can get into West Germany. And by 1961, 20% of the East German population has fled into the West via West Berlin. We're looking at about 3.5 million Germans between 1945 and 1961. And the East Germans/Soviets built this wall to stop East Germany is going to be emptied of East Germans. And the wall will fall in 1989, and we're fast forwarding here, but the Soviets will, under Gorbachev, will no longer be willing to enforce their control over, border policy in Eastern Europe, and with that, the wall will fall. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the Soviets want to protect Cuba from U.S. capitalist imperialist aggression. Remember the Bay of Pigs, this attempted overthrow of the Castro regime, and previously there's a whole bunch of CIA-supported sort of commando raids on Cuban coastal facilities. And Khrushchev is going to defend this foothold he has in Latin America, and he's going to put missiles. He's going to put missiles in Cuba, and this is going to lead to a blockade called a quarantine. And the ultimate resolution here is really twofold. One is the Soviets pull their missiles out. Khrushchev backs down, he blinks, but the Americans promise not to invade Cuba, not to overthrow Castro, and to remove their missiles from Turkey. Czechoslovakia in 1968, you've got Alexander Dubček is allowing liberalization. He's relaxing restrictions on the media, on the press, and on speech, and on travel, on assembly, and he's decentralizing economic control. A lot of what sort of foreshadowing what's going to happen under Gorbachev in the Soviet Union in later years, but this is when Leonid Brezhnev is in charge, and Brezhnev replaces Khrushchev. Khrushchev is kind of pushed out for bowing to the Americans in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Soviets will invade Czechoslovakia. This Prague Spring, this opening, this airing out the system here will be crushed. And the Brezhnev doctrine is that there will be no surrender of capitalism in any Eastern European satellite country, that there will be solidarity, meaning that the Warsaw Pact under Soviet leadership, like in 1956 in Hungary, will stifle any reformist nonsense. Détente under Nixon is this relaxation of tensions, and this often this is translated as peaceful coexistence. And the idea here is that we will deliberately pursue policies to reduce tensions, such as I grew up during I was in high school during the détente years here, and some examples of détente are exchanges of sport teams and artists, things like ballet dance, not belly dance, but ballet, and scientists, scientific exchanges, and you have the SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, is signed, reducing nuclear weapons, and you've got the Skylab and the Soyuz launches, where these two space labs go up in outer space, and they link up, and cosmonauts and American astronauts shake hands and swap food and do experiments. So these things are happening under the policy of détente. And one of the goals of Nixon is to divide the Soviets and the Chinese, who were buddying up to. And this is a Nixon policy. The Helsinki Accords, 1975. This is signed while Ford is president. And the idea of Helsinki is we're going to sort of state that there's this inviolability of borders, that there won't be any invasions, there won't be any arguments over where the borders are now, long after World War II is over. There won't be any use of force, and there will be the respect of human rights. And this is, at the time, there's a lot of, not just skepticism, but the feeling that, we're being bamboozled and we're being naive. But this agreement to respect human rights is going to be brought out and sort of dusted off, shaken off, and used by dissidents during the Gorbachev years, when he has got this glasnost policy of openness. Reagan in the USSR, Reagan is going to increase arms spending, and some people argue that his arms spending, the Soviets can't keep up with us, and this sort of bankrupts the Soviet economy to a certain extent. He denounces the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and of course American liberals are sort of aghast at his provoking the Soviets unnecessarily. And Reagan's going to continue the policy of Carter to give arms to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and that's likened to sort of a Soviet Vietnam. About something along the lines of 10,000 Soviets are going to be casualties, killed and wounded in Afghanistan through American weapons that are going into the hands of the freedom fighters in Afghanistan, the same people that are fighting the American army as we speak. One more foreign group to get out. But Reagan is eventually going to sign START, and that's the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with Gorbachev in 1991. So things are going to end here with kind of a simpatico relationship between Gorbachev and Reagan, who are these sort of charismatic leaders who actually kind of get along. And there will be arms reduction after a long period of arms growth, arms proliferation, things like introducing the cruise missiles into Europe. Mikhail Gorbachev, this is the last leader of the Soviet Union. Some economic problems in the USSR ever since 1917, this persistent shortage of consumer goods. If you can think of it, if you can name it, there was a shortage of housing, a shortage of food, a shortage of shoes, of clothing, of cars. I mean, anything that you wanted to buy, there was a shortage of. And a contrast here with Stalin. Former AP question here. A political difference here. Remember, Stalin is this totalitarian dictator who killed people by the millions. He had his purges where he goes after about 600,000 of the old Bolsheviks. Stalin is this guy who is going to, take whole people groups and move them out of various areas to Siberia. He's got his whole Gulag system, this archipelago, as named by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And the contrast here is Gorbachev has got glasnost, political openness. He's going to eventually allow free elections. He's going to allow free speech and assembly. He's going to allow the growth of religion openly. And this is one of the things that's going to lead to the downfall of the Soviet Union. Economically, under Stalin, you've got this total ending of any capitalism, any private ownership of the means of production. He shuts down the NEP, the new economic policy of Lenin that's helping rebuild Russia after this World War I. And Stalin's got his 5-year plans focusing on capital production, building of dams and cement works and steel mills and building tractors and military hardware at the expense of consumer spending. And he's got collectivization. The idea here is to make the country more efficient by having machinery in farming, and you have the killing of millions of kulaks through starvation. These are the independent farmers, in particular Ukrainians. So you've got this economic regimentation, denial of the private ownership of production. And the contrast here with Gorbachev is he's going to allow perestroika. This is economic restructuring. He's going to allow limited but growing private ownership of the means of production. And this is a little bit sort of a throwback to the NEP under Lenin. And perestroika and glasnost, these are two terms which you got to know. You got to know what they are, what they mean. And they're going to lead to just kind of uncorking the bottle here. letting the genie of freedom out. Solidarity is this trade union. It's the first free trade union in the Warsaw Pact, not controlled by the government, and it's led by this electrician, Lech Walesa. It looks like Walesa, and I always heard it pronounced where I was listening to the news and reading, it pronounced Valenza. And Lech is he's this champion of resistance to control by the state. And in the first year, Solidarity is going to grow from an economic, trade union into a political movement of 10 million followers. It's going to lead to civil resistance against the communist government and demands for a reform. The Soviets, of course, under Brezhnev, are going to threaten to invade under this concept of the Brezhnev Doctrine. And General Jaruzelski is going to basically crush Solidarity, throw leaders like Lech into prison. But the Poles are going to have champions in both Ronald Reagan and in the Pope. Remember, the Poles are overwhelmingly Catholic, and with this support and with the strong support by Solidarity still of the Polish people, and with the relaxation by Gorbachev of saying he's no longer going to support through the threat of invasion conformity. In 1990, free elections will be held in Poland, and Lech Walesa will be elected the first president of free Poland. This is really the foot in the door. This is the camel's nose in the tent. This is the beginning of the collapse of communism in Europe. Although I suppose you could argue the fall of the Berlin Wall, but this is the first country that throws off the shackles of communist tyranny. Let's see, looking on the review sheet here, we are at the death of Marshal Tito. Remember, Tito is this leader who held all these factions in Yugoslavia together until his death, in which case the largest piece of Yugoslavia, Serbia, is led by Slobodan Milosevic, who sees that communism no longer has any credibility, and he creates himself from a communist to being a nationalist, a Serbian leader who's going to keep Yugoslavia together under Serbian control. And you have a series of secession movements. The Slovenes, or Slovenia, peels off, declares their independence. You have the Croatians declare their independence. And you have fighting between the Serb army and the Slovenes. The Slovenes win. The Croatians fight longer, harder. A lot of people die. Croatia gets their independence. And then Bosnia peels off. And Bosnia, remember, Bosnia was a flashpoint in World War I. A lot of Serbs in Bosnia. There's the creation of a Bosnian, sort of a puppet regime, a Bosnian republic. And you have a policy of really sort of not genocide, that's too strong a word, but policy of forcing the Bosnian Muslims to submit. Sarajevo is surrounded and it's pummeled with artillery, and there's the killing of just tens of thousands of civilians. There's hundreds of thousands of refugees. There's a policy of mass rape of tens of thousands of Bosnian women by Serbian soldiers. And this leads to the intervention of NATO, the bombing of Belgrade, and the putting of NATO boots, largely American boots, on the ground after a totally unsuccessful policy of embargo against weapons to the warring parties, and a totally useless intervention of UN peacekeepers who are basically shoved around by the Serbian army. Effects on, by the way, Yugoslavia after this brutal war. The six pieces of Yugoslavia declared their independence, and I'm doing this by memory here. See if I can remember them: the Slovenes, the Croats, the Montenegrins, the Bosnians, the Macedonians peel off, leaving Serbia. And then later, of course, Kosovo, southern part of Serbia, peels off, largely about 90% Albanians. And this is between 1991 with Slovenia and 2008 with Kosovo. Effects of nationalism in Czechoslovakia. You've got the Velvet Divorce in 1993. The poorer part of Czechoslovakia, the Slovaks, they peel off and they create their own government, their own nation, with a capital in Bratislava. The Yugoslavs, of course, peel off with this horrible civil war caused by Slobodan Milosevic's refusal to allow these smaller pieces to go their own way. And then the Soviet Union, with Lithuania at first declaring their independence in 1990. And eventually the USSR will dissolve, and you need to know this date, 1991. December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. It implodes. Every single republic, the 15 republics, will all declare independence, including Russia. The Supreme Soviet of Russia is going to recall all of its representatives to the Moscow Soviet government. And on December 25th, Gorbachev will resign and he'll turn the nuclear codes over to Boris Yeltsin, who's the president of an independent Russia. So what's going to happen is the Soviet Union will see, I don't have the order here, but it's going to see Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan and the Kyrgyzstan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan and I don't know who I've left off, or Georgia, Armenia, all pull out, and then Russia pulls out. So, there's basically a flag, a national anthem, and Gorbachev, who doesn't have anything that he's ruler over. So, very interesting. The Soviet Union collapses because of nationalism. But you should know about the impact of nationalism here. Nationalism after communism falls. It's going to cause Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union to break up. Well, there you have it. There's kind of a quick thumbnail sketch review. Oh, one more comment here. Some other reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union, not just all these pieces pulling out, but there's just, if you get a question on this, on what causes the Soviet Union collapse, it's kind of the culmination of decades and decades of just utter economic failure, failure to provide for the basic consumer needs of the Soviet Union. You have this disastrous war in Afghanistan where you've got tens of thousands of bodies are coming back in coffins. You have the unleashing of glasnost, of political free speech and openness and voting. And you have perestroika, you have this economic restructuring and people starting their little businesses. And then you have secession. And all these things are going to lead to this vanishing of this brutal, horrible regime which caused so much human suffering from 1917 until 1991. And of course, we will continue our discussion of nationalism and Russia under Putin in the next unit. But there you have it. Study hard, study early, study often, study smart, and good luck on the test coming up. Bye. Signing out.